It looks like Silicon Valley is getting into the UFO business. New UFO international data collecting apps are currently in development. How will the average citizen's privacy be protected? And what if these companies sell data to governments around the world or to larger corporate companies? And what type of power and money does UAP, big data, bring to the company that's holding it? Internet pioneer, computer scientist, venture capitalist, author, and astronomer Dr. Jacques Vallée answers these questions along with touching on AI technology potentially used for future government databases and his thoughts around Silicon Valley and big UAP data. Join us as we get rebelliously curious. Jacques, thank you for joining me on Rebelliously Curious. It is an honor to speak with you, and I've been really excited to have this conversation.
Great to see you. Lots of things to talk about.
There's so many things to talk about. And let's just start off with your legacy as being an internet pioneer. And I have to ask then, how is it connected to all of the UAP work and research that you've done over the years?
I think it was sort of natural for me to become interested in computers. When I was still in France and working on my master's degree and so on. I had always been interested in science. So, the UAP question sort of was a natural one for me to be interested in. I thought there was, the computer was the right tool to try to analyze the patterns of what people were reporting. So I started out not so much fascinated by, obviously, I was with a background in astronomy. I was fascinated with the idea that these things were probably coming from beyond the Earth. But what was interesting for me was to apply what I knew about analysis of data to what people were reporting, because I think that was the way I could construct a model of what the phenomenon was. And I could also construct a model of what it wasn't, because most of the data can be explained. I remember, my first job was at Paris Observatory. We were tracking satellites, and we were, a government office. So people were writing to us from all over France about what they saw in the sky. And most of it, in those days, people had no idea what a satellite looked like. And so we had, of course, the schedules of all the early satellites. And fortunately, in those days, you could do that with one sheet of paper. There were not that many satellites in orbit. So we could reassure people that what they had seen was a man-made object and so on. But there were also a number of letters that had to do with people reporting what they thought were UFOs, and most of those could be explained. Somebody seeing the moon rise over a lake, through a layer of fog. You could think that's a spaceship coming, illuminating you. So we spent quite a bit of time doing that, and then there were also cases we could not explain. What intrigued me is that the cases we could not explain, we were not reporting to anybody. And I think this was because of a stigma which still exists in science, that, Paris Observatory is, an august institution, and it's not supposed to see things in the sky that it doesn't understand. And especially in answering a member of the public. So that is really what got me started, because I thought if if as scientists, if we don't talk about this, even within ourselves, within the group, what does it mean about the total number of cases there must be out there?
For
There
sure.
must be hundreds or thousands of cases that nobody is taking into account. So that got me interested. And by then I was, a pretty good computer hacker, a computer scientist. And I started building catalogs and looking for patterns in the data. And there were patterns in the data. And so I extended my contacts with colleagues and with other people who are interested, and but I never tried to hide what I was doing. I mean, to me, that was obviously a scientific problem from the beginning. And as you know, I started publishing early under my own name, and that never hurt me in science. Contrary to what many of my colleagues think, they don't want to admit, even now, I mean, they don't want to admit that they are fascinated with the subject. They read everything about it, but when you're in the office, you would never know that.
It's true. A lot of people are very quiet or hush about the topic.
Stigma, but it is being removed.
Oh, for sure. And I hope it does over time. And we'll see that. And, a lot of other scientists are coming forward. And we look at Avi Loeb and we look at Gary Nolan. And I have a lot of respect for them along with yourself because they are coming forward and hopefully removing that stigma. I I want to ask you too about the threat narrative. You've worked on multiple databases, developing UA from like ATIP recently, all the way to one of the first databases ever developed to research and catalog UAP data. Over the course of both databases and all the work that you've done, what are your thoughts and the data, I should say, that you've collected? What are your thoughts within the threat narrative? And is there anything in the data that you find that would point to saying that, there is a larger threat narrative that we need to be, that is more apparent?
In the beginning, I had access to the first database or the first files of cases that were done in France, and those were done by the French Air Force, even before the CNES became involved and all that. They had about 300 cases that were never publicized. This was just within the military. And I had a friend who was in the Air Force and put me in contact with the people who had the file. That was very interesting because those were visual observations by pilots, radar observations, and so on that were, but and this was in 1962, if you can believe that. So, we're going back to antiquity here. But the Air Force took it seriously, the French Air Force. They didn't publish all that. They were under instructions to just analyze the data. And since it wasn't a threat, they had no reason to intervene and so on. But that convinced me, that was the first file that I compiled. And it convinced me that, yes, there was something real, not only from the public writing to the observatory, but also from the documents from the French Air Force, which was over France, but also over Morocco. I remember one case was tracked on radar and by a pilot over Morocco for more than half an hour. So when people talk about the limits, well, yes, but we've had that kind of data for a long, long time. So I started building those files and doing statistics. And as you know, when I came to the US, I was then free to work on this without any constraint. My boss at the University of Texas was Gérard de Vaucouleurs, who was a member of the Academy of Sciences, and he said he was fascinated with the whole subject and openly. And he told me that I could use the computer in Austin to do the statistics I wanted. The first thing I wanted to do was to look for patterns that people had alluded to, certain patterns in time of day, in geography, and so on. And I started writing software to test those patterns. Some of them were true, and some of them I could disprove. So we made some progress on that, and I published all that as I went. In those days, a number of people who were really interested in that, was pretty small. But we started forming a community of knowledgeable people. And then I met Dr. Hynek, and he hired me at Northwestern. And the rest was history, because then he said, that I had a job at the observatory working mostly on stellar, physics. But I could use a computing center to continue compiling data, especially the data from the U.S. Air Force. That we had a copy of the Air Force files. So I started doing that with the help of my wife, and we spent 4 years going through the entire Air Force files, which were something like 20,000 cases, many of which could be explained. And, last week I got an email from somebody on the internet who told me that he had built a file of all the unidentified cases in the Air Force files. And there's about 350 of them out of all the files. But, that's not enough, because the Air Force was calling something unidentified for all kinds of reasons. And this was not really analyzed. I had redone the statistics of the Air Force files, and I found that about a quarter of all the data was unidentified. That's a quarter of 20,000 cases, okay?
Wow.
It's not 300 or 400 cases. And out of that, I started building another catalog on top of that, and found the same patterns that I had found in Europe. And I showed that to Dr. Hynek to convince him that you couldn't just look at a phenomenon like this just in the US, and you couldn't do it just from the military data. Although, the military data was not that bad. I mean, everybody is bad-mouthing, the Air Force, and they were trying to do an impossible job, but they did collect the data and record it, and I think we should be grateful to them for that. They did eliminate a number of known causes for that, in places where they had radar. They knew what the object was. They knew it was an airplane. They knew it was a rocket fired, or it was. So that was very useful. A big turning point was when the Condon Committee was appointed to look at the data once and for all. Dr. Hynek and I were the first to testify before Professor Condon and the entire committee. And I turned over to them my computer files. Dr. Dave Saunders was a well-known, primarily a psychologist, but a very good statistician, and he continued to expand the files. If you looked at the files, it was obvious that there was a phenomenon that was unknown. Professor Condon and his group ignored the data, and as you know, issued a report to the Academy of Sciences that said that this was not a subject for science, essentially.
Right.
They didn't say that they had identified it. They just said it's not of interest to science. They had really analyzed only a small part of the data that was sent to them, and they really hadn't done any significant work on the database that I gave them, or their own database that Dr. Saunders had developed. Dr. Saunders went on working with Dr. Hynek as well, and continued to work on the data with QFOS,
Okay.
and the and then after a while, everybody ignored the conclusions of the Condon report, which had been endorsed by the Academy of Sciences and by the New York Times as a definitive endpoint of all this stupid UFO craze in the United States. They never looked at the foreign data, although I had put them in touch with some of the people doing research in Europe, and they never followed up on that. So to me, there was a big restart. By then, I was at Stanford University, again, with large computers. And I knew a lot more about, I had done, my PhD was on artificial intelligence based on large databases. In 1968, everybody assumes that AI is a new thing, yes, AI is new as far as the public is concerned, but AI, has been there since my program was the first example of AI applied to scientific databases other than a chemical database AI application developed at Stanford on a database called Dendral that identified complex molecules.
Right.
Mine was addressed to stars and star clusters and so on. So by then, I was pretty sure there was something there. And we, with Dr. Hynek, we had built a college we called the Invisible College, of academicians and people in different countries who were doing privately with their own money, who were doing research on UFOs. And at Stanford, I had the pleasure of working for Professor Sturrock, who had started looking at the data as well. And we worked together on expanding the data and starting to look at materials. So, and this was, a long time ago, 40 years ago. And we, Professor Sturrock started looking at isotope data based on materials recovered after an encounter with a UFO close to the ground that left traces or left strange materials that should not have been at that location. And Professor Sturrock has retired now from Stanford and has turned over to me his materials, and I'm working on them now with another Stanford professor named Gary Nolan. So, that we continue doing this. I mean, that's the way you do science. You don't wait for, the academy to tell you what to do. So
100%.
at this point, to answer your question, the databases are much larger. I was part of the ATIP program. All of us had the same clearances at the same level under the Bigelow, aerospace space science project, which has been renamed now with a bunch of acronyms from the Pentagon, but essentially it's a BAS project, which to my surprise has not been declassified yet, but it's probably a good thing because a lot of the data is personal and includes injuries to people. And until that can be anonymized, I don't think that database should be made public. Eventually it should be made public, but the problem is a privacy issue, and I think we must respect the privacy of the witnesses who have trusted us with their data, in many cases, their injuries.
For sure. Yeah. I agree. Like, I think that there's multiple privacy issues when you get into big data. And
yes.
Yeah. And I'd love to bridge into that when we look at new apps that are being developed in Silicon Valley right now. We look at Enigma Labs is one of them. You know, what are the issues then with these types of apps being developed? And what maybe should first ask you, what are your thoughts around these apps being developed within Silicon Valley and not the government? And then what does that mean to privacy issues?
The There was a strange episode a few months ago when a number of people claimed that they had started a company to make the data from the classified project available publicly. Now, there have been a number of databases that have been published. I've published, part of mine and so on. What we did under ATIP or under BAS was a step above. I mean, it was a step towards using AI on the entire global database. So we started with the idea of a database that was 260,000 cases from all over the world. Some of that had been published before, so people could use that as they saw. Um, but a lot of it was new, and a lot of it was new in English because we had, as part of this was the largest database project addressed to UAP ever. I'm very proud to have directed that project. It was, a sizable number of people working full time for 2 years, including French translators, Spanish translators, Portuguese translators, a lot of data from Brazil, Italian, and Russian. So we were able to build a framework that covered, and the framework itself had a methodology behind it that made it proper for applying artificial intelligence to it at the next level or at the next two levels. I had designed three levels. The project was stopped after 2 years of a projected 5 years. So we could never apply the other two levels that I had already designed. So what we ended up with, and what maybe made public eventually, is a very large database of raw data. So if somebody thinks that they can take that and apply AI to it next week and get important results in science, I don't think, I mean, there are lots of clever people out there that I honor as colleagues, but I don't think they will get anywhere close to any valid research because a lot of that data, again, like the ones that I was looking at Paris Observatory, decades ago, is polluted by not so much by hoaxes. I mean, there are occasional hoaxes, but we can throw them out. But by just errors made in good faith by the witnesses. We don't need 260,000 cases. If you were studying kangaroos, you would need 260,000 kangaroos. So I think we could end up with a very good, refined, database of 20,000 or 30,000 cases. And I pretty much could do that, but other people will eventually have the data and they have all the capability to do it. I want to go in a different direction now. But that database was the high water mark in terms of applying computer technology to the UAP problem.
Right. And where do you see now, like Enigma going with that? Because you're looking at a database of about 20,000 or more that are samples of, really unidentified flying objects or UAPs. And then we have Enigma Labs, who's looking to capture all of this around the world globally. Where does that leave us with then the data that they're going to be collecting that might be not as accurate. And we're not sure how they're going to be filtering that. But then also, what does that mean when they're capturing, internationally, if they succeed and everybody decides to use this app and is taking photos and videos of the skies and of the land? If they actually succeed in this, the conversation is what kind of, money and what kind of power comes with that, because that's a lot of large data that potentially could be used in multiple different ways, especially if it's UFO data.
Yes. And I think that's part of the reasoning behind the fact that so far the work of Bass has not been completely declassified. I mean, parts of it have been mentioned in the press and so on, but and certainly the database itself has not been turned over to a university or public institution. To the way things work, organizations that have the proper access could use a database now. I mean, it could remain classified, and some of that work could be continued by organizations or industrial firms that have access to classified data. So, and they, obviously they have qualified computer scientists who would know what to do with it. I mean, they would immediately recognize, what I had designed and what the team did, and could build on that. It was supposed to be used by not just by us, but turned over to the community. So that's no problem. The problem is that the second phase that I had designed was a phase of cleaning up the data and analyzing it, not so much for its basic nature, but to eliminate the errors. And I had done that before, a long time before the web, just using the internet. In 1986, I had designed an artificial intelligence program to help me screen the data I had. Because no matter how cautious you are as a scientist, you are not going to remember all the possible things that could possibly show up in the sky, under different conditions. Now, in going through the Air Force files, I mean, I had recognized about 40 or 50 major patterns of things that would, things that you wouldn't necessarily think of, that have a very simple explanation when somebody tells you the explanation. But when you're looking at it, it's, I mean, you would swear that we're being invaded by aliens if when you see it. Okay. I had one example of that myself. One time when I was in Texas, I saw lights in the sky that were obviously organized in groups. There were 4 big lights that were moving. There was no sound. The sky was clear, as it can be in Texas. Those were just moving through the sky, 4 big lights. And then a number of smaller lights arrived and formed clusters around these big lights. And then there were like little explosions of fire or light, and then all these things went off in different directions. Well, I asked around because it just was very strange. I couldn't imagine the way it was. And it was a refueling operation from Travis Air Force Base. Well, yes, tankers, there are 4 tankers. They turned on their big lights to illuminate the reservoirs, their own reservoirs on their wings. Okay? And then the fighters come in and they go drink from, you have 2 on each wing. So you end up with, 16 fighters all getting refueled in midair And then when it's done, the lights go off and the fighters go off in their own formation. If you don't know that, I mean, um, if you were an aborigine, in somewhere in the north of Brazil, and you saw this over your head, I mean, you couldn't possibly find the explanation, but there is a very rational, completely accurate explanation. And I've seen refueling operations a few times since then. I know what they look like. But if you see it, if you see it during the day, it's a little bit easier. But if you see it at dusk or at night, then it's very, very strange indeed. So you have to have you may not think of that as a human analyst looking at the data. The computer will think of everything. The computer will look at all 50 possible configurations of things in the sky that could account for some of it. And then it's a dialogue. And, people think that AI is going to give us a solution and turn on the orders and so on. That's not the way to use AI. To me, the proper way to use AI is as a very, very smart data companion who says, have you thought of this? Have you thought of that? These are the statistics I get. I'm getting, and maybe you should look into two different possible explanations, not one, but there may be two or three different patterns that would match what the person has reported. And we need to do that, and that's a proper use of AI. It's not magic. I could show you the software. We could re-implement it now. If we had turned that over to, and I proposed turning it over to the French project, that would have simplified a lot of the work, because it's very boring, difficult work to analyze all the possible explanations for an observation from the public. It's very labor intensive. Much of that labor can be done by the computer. And that's
Right.
AI, because it's not a simple program, because there is no one answer. There is a light in the sky. It could be 6 different things. So the computer needs to say, well, it could be 6 different things. It's not 50 different things. It's 6 different things. But among those, how long did it last? What color was the light, and so on. And then you have a dialogue, an intelligent dialogue with the machine that, concentrates the decision on one or two possibilities. Then,
Right.
you take your car, you go see the guy, and you ask him more information on the site. But at least you're not wasting a lot of time, with hypotheses that are not going anywhere.
Yeah, and I think the development of AI for sure, like using it properly within the future when collecting data, because you've been saying a lot within this conversation about the correlations and the patterns are so important within the data. When these apps are developing right now within Silicon Valley, they're going to potentially, not that I know of, but they'll potentially, I would imagine, be using AI and to looking at all of these patterns and looking at all of this data around the world. Should we be concerned that these Silicon Valley private corporate companies are going to be selling that data to, let's say, our American government, but maybe also to foreign adversaries or to other governments around the world and to larger corporate companies like Meta, for example, or other larger Fortune 500 companies for like Amazon, for example? Should we be worried that they'll be using that data and be selling it to people that could actually take advantage of it?
So that is certainly part of the debate that's going on now. I'm sure Congress is aware of that. Um, that's one more reason perhaps for keeping some of the data classified. I mean, some of it has to be classified simply because the instrument that detected the UAP was a classified instrument. For example, on the Nimitz, you know, the radars were brand new radars from a new generation. I'm sure on that screen, there are a number of things that, correspond to capabilities that have not been made public or are not used commonly in industry or in aviation in general, but are specific to tracking an enemy. So, but the data, enough data has already been published by people like me. I mean, in different catalogs, different databases that we put online. The largest database of pilot data was developed by a friend of mine in France in collaboration with Dr. Richard Hayes from NASA, who's now retired from NASA, but they worked together, and I helped, a little bit in the structure. But that data is unique because it's from pilots and has been reviewed. And then there is a special section of the database, about 700 cases, that consist of interviews of pilots that were done, not by the press, but interviews within the organization, whether that's TWA or Air France or the Air Force. So you have data from private pilots, airline pilots, and military pilots, all of which is in the database and it's public. So anybody can use that. So the underlying question, and I watched, of course, the debate, the congressional discussions a few months ago, and I think I heard two conflicting opinions from the members of Congress. One was just a personal statement that if now the UAP problem is a serious problem, then the data should be kept in the interest of the country. As you said, I mean, there could be all kinds of new developments in industry, and that could flow from that. That should benefit American industry. And as you may know, in my career, the last 40 years, I've been investing primarily in American industry, also occasionally in Europe, but across venture capital. 5 different venture capital funds. So yes, I mean, that's the way we make progress. That's the way we get good computers and good software like this. So I'm all for that. On the other hand, I also heard one of the members comment that we should look at what other countries have because it's a global problem. And, we talk to the Russians all the time about atomic bombs. I mean, we don't talk about secrets, and they don't talk about their secrets, but there are common issues. One common issue is we don't want to go to war thinking that, a flight of birds is Russian missiles. And they don't want to go to war for the wrong reason either. So we don't want to have a war, but we certainly don't want to have a war on false interpretation of data, which is one problem with AI. What if AI gets reports on flights of birds or a strange meteor that re-enters the atmosphere on a trajectory that would be a Russian impact trajectory, and we launch the Strategic Air Command? How do you stop that? And people have thought. I mean, colleagues of ours in computer science have obviously thought about what kind of computer program you should have and what kind of control you should have on it. So you have these 2 points of view. One is that we should communicate with other countries. Now, I'm in a strange situation because I'm a member of the scientific committee for the French group, the French CNES, which is a space. The French have given that responsibility not to the military, but to the civilian group that is responsible for space exploration. They are the group that launched the American telescope, the Kepler telescope and so on, was launched from Kourou, which is a French base, on the equator. France is the only way of launching straight on the equator. And, it's Cape Canaveral is a very good location. But if you want to take full advantage of the rotation of the Earth, you have to launch from the equator. And Kourou is just a few degrees off the equator in the north of Brazil. And, most people don't know that France has a common border with Brazil, but, they do. So, of course, in Guyana, in French Guyana, which is part of France, it's a French département. It's not a colony.
Right.
So there is a common border between France and Brazil. And it's perfect to launch American rockets, Italian rockets, and until recently they were launching Soyuz from there, as well as Ariane. So there is a lot of experience there. And that group, the reason I'm in France now is that we have a meeting in a week from now in Toulouse, where 6 countries are invited and will be presenting their data. There is no American data being presented. There is an American representative who will speak, and someone who is actually a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, who has continued to develop the pilot database, and he is American, so he'll be representing the US. But all the other countries are coming with their data, including Italy, Spain, the UK, and a few other countries. So I'm looking forward to that because that's the first time we have an international conference at a time when the subject has been demystified, has been open and recognized as a valid scientific subject. So I'm really looking forward with that. I'm happy to have lived long enough to see that. That's a day, I think of Dr. Hynek and how much he would have enjoyed being part of that. That finally the ridicule, has been pushed aside. I mean, when you have in the main, in the cathedral, the National Cathedral in Washington, the director of Harvard Observatory, Dr. Avi Loeb, the director of NASA, and the director of Central Intelligence, all saying we must take that data seriously. It's not just, imagination and errors. And by the way, we don't have an explanation within the US government, and we should turn that over to science. I think that's a great day, and that's irreversible. I mean, we may go forward and make mistakes or whatever, but that decision is irreversible. And I feel very grateful to have lived long enough to do that. I hope to contribute to it in some way as part of what we need to do now. Because what we need now to do now is to not just to demystify the data, because that is going to happen quickly, but to go over this information that you and I are discussing now. People don't know that. I mean, scientists at high levels in universities have never looked at this. They've assumed that the Academy of Sciences was right. It was the last word, that all this was, vague lights in the sky and drunken cowboys. Well, it's not drunken cowboys.
No, it's something amazing. And you are right. It's such an amazing time to be alive, and through all the work that you've done and now coming to this point and seeing that the work that you've done is becoming even more into fruition into the science community. It's unbelievable. I have to ask you, as a venture capitalist, what type of money in the future is AI big data? Because they always say that there's no money in UFOs. That's always a common theme within it. But if we're getting Silicon Valley and a lot of other major corporations and even just investors getting involved in this topic, then what is the money going to look like? And what type of money would that be? And I guess, is there money in big data?
Well, all the investments I've made with my fund, with my colleagues, with my partners, uh, were in high technology and usually the first check. So it's easy to invest in a company that has 5 years of existence, where it has all the financial, data and everything else. It has a staff of 300 and so on, and you analyze it in a certain way. But at the beginning, all you have is an idea and a couple of bright guys or women, and you have to become part of a team, and you have to. So I've seen that situation in the first day, first check, uh, the first experiments in a number of companies. Some of them uh, in software, some of them in hardware and communications. Obviously, in development of internet, where we finance a number of companies that became unicorns. Became worth over $1 billion over 5 or 10 years. So it's a lot of work, and it doesn't happen overnight. Even when even when you have a proof of concept, we don't have a proof of concept in anti-gravity. We have ideas, we have things that might work away from the Earth, where there is no gravity from the Earth has only a minimal impact. So you can create small forces that will be noticeable, that will be important. But we don't have anti-gravity here on Earth. If I drop my pen, I've just performed an experiment that modern science doesn't explain. Okay. I mean, we have all the equations for it. We have all the equations. We can tell you how long it's going to take to fall, but we don't tell you why. We have no idea why. In fact, we have two theories that have completely conflicting ideas about why my pen, just fell. So we have a lot of work to do, and from that point of view, your question is, can we use the observations, the best observations from UAPs, to have a proof of concept that would lead us to a new theory that would then, once it's fully developed, would replace Einstein's relativity and quantum mechanics, or use them and fuse them into something that takes it to the next level and resolves the contradictions that we have now, in physics. So it's not going to happen overnight. We have, but there is a lot of venture capital these days that will go into completely hypothetical ideas, just because some of it might work. So as opposed to in Europe, the problem of venture capital in Europe is that you have to prove that it's going to work before anybody will give you €1, okay, or £1 or £1 Swiss franc. But in the US, you can get $1 million just to try something, and that's the way some of the greatest inventions have come. So I believe in that system. I believe in the way it's done. Yes, there will be breakthroughs, but there isn't going to be any instant breakthrough. And I think it will take, as venture capital did. I mean, it will take the talents of people around the world, not just some one lab in New Mexico, close to Sandia, working on it for 6 months. I don't think that will work. It's a complex problem. Now we have good data. As you may know, with Paola Harris, we just published or republished a new edition of Trinity, the best kept secret, which is based on the work that Paola has done for something like 8 years. And she brought me into it, and I've worked with her for about the last 4 years, going back to the site in New Mexico, where something very strange, they controlled crash in 1945, 2 days after the capitulation of Japan. Now, we have the witnesses. The first witness was a pilot, an Army Air Force pilot. When you go back to 1945, you have to let go of some common ideas. 1945, there was no US Air Force. There were airplanes, but they were under the Army, and the pilots were wearing Army uniforms. There was no CIA. There were no flying saucers. The term flying saucer is going to be invented by Kenneth Arnold 2 years later, in 1947. President Truman is going to create the CIA in 1947. President Truman is going to create the US Air Force as a separate branch of the military 2 years later. So what we have is very bright witnesses, including a pilot who is coming in for a landing at Alamogordo. Alamogordo is the air base inside White Sands, where the first atom bomb has been detonated a month earlier, to the day, a month earlier, at the Trinity site. And the control tower tells him, there's a communication tower that where we've lost communication. Can you, and it's on your landing path, can you take a look at it? And he circles that tower, which is just outside the fences of, it's on a private ranch, but it's outside the borders of White Sands itself, of the military zone and of the atomic zone. And so he circles the tower and sees that it is bent. It's been hit by something. It's lost communication. And then he wonders why. He sees some smoke in the underbrush. And then he sees the smoke comes from a fire in the brush around an egg-shaped object. He describes it. He says there is something that has crashed in the bushes. And then he says there are two little Indians with their horses that are on that ranch near where that object has fallen. The two little Indians are not Indian. Mr. Padilla, Jose Padilla, is part Indian through his mother. But the two kids are basically American. The other one, Remy Baca, is from an Italian family, but they speak English and Spanish indifferently. The two kids are not going to talk about what they've seen for 60 years, until they talk to a few researchers who took the trouble of tracking them down, but they didn't get the whole story. Paola Harris saw an article in the local paper, and she traced them to actually the state of Washington and the state of California, where they were working as grown men. Mr. Padilla was a highway patrol officer, specialized in the inspection of trucks, of large trucks. And Remy Baca was a businessman in the state of Washington who was active in politics. That comes up in an important way because we know through Mr. Baca that Dixie Lee Ray, when she was elected, when she was running for governor in the state of Washington, was helped by Remy Baca, who was very active with the Spanish-speaking population in the state of Washington, in that Spanish-speaking community. So he was close to her during her re-election campaign. She knew about what he had seen, and she showed him the file. The file is at the Atomic Energy Commission, which has its own type of clearances, different from the State Department and different from most of the Pentagon clearances that go, confidential, secret, top secret, and then above top secret for different levels. So, so we can relate all that now through, the actually, excellent analysis that Paola Harris has done. And then I came in to look at the actual data, and I've been working with her and with Mr. Padilla at the site to document the site and understand every single step of the recovery of that object, because the kids were there for 10 days. So it's not like Roswell. Actually, it reinforces Roswell. Because
for sure.
That there was a precedent for Roswell. It makes Roswell more credible. But in Roswell, nobody saw the thing fall. It was seen later. There were, as you know, until now, there is still a discussion about which site is the right one or the main site and exactly how it happened and so on. It happened under horrible meteorological conditions. So there was confusion about the data.
So I should ask you, Jacques, then, why do you feel that Trinity then hasn't become a mainstream topic? We've talked about this, and it's hard to break through to media, and it's hard to break through to people when they maybe haven't heard it in a larger scale. Roswell is so big, but this is pretty large as a case itself, and there's multiple witnesses too. And you're talking about also crash retrievals, which is obviously becoming a major conversation right now within the UAP community and with various scientists too. So why do you just think it hasn't had a resurgence yet, and it will at some point? Maybe when, whistleblowers come forward talking about more crash retrievals, hopefully next year.
Well, people are fixated on 1947, including Congress. They say we need all the data since 1947. Well, I sent this book to the congressman who made one of the interesting comments at those hearings about continuing the research. 1945 is hard for people to put their minds to that time. I remember 1945. I mean, I was 6-year-old in 1945. So I can relate to those kids who were there, trying to take care of the ranch. They were trying to take care of the ranch because there was nobody else. Everybody was at war, or the able-bodied, men were either in the Pacific or ready to attack Japan, or they were still in Europe. Hitler was dead by that time, but the army hadn't been repatriated yet. So I can understand why it's hard for people to place themselves in that time. People have come up with all kinds of excuses. The kids are lying. But if they are lying, why do they wait 60 years to tell the lie? They had every opportunity at the time of Roswell. They were older at the time of Roswell. People would have been delighted to hear that. They never spoke. They never spoke because once the object was located by them, they reported it to their father. The father came in on day number 3. There was nobody there on day number 2. We think that the army probably sent a detachment to clean up the site and see what that was, but they hadn't named a task force to go retrieve the object. So I think it was still the pilots who knew where it was who went back there and did some cleaning. The beings themselves were no longer there on the 3rd day when the father came with a state policeman. The kids actually drove them to the place. The kids were driving the family truck. You're not going to hit anything in New Mexico. It's only in 1945 when you're, on the dirt roads. So the kids drove the truck, and they led the patrol car and the father to the place. The kids were not allowed to go inside, but the father and the officer went inside. When they came out, they were very somber and very serious. They set the kids down and they said, look, nobody talks about this. This is not for our family. This is for the army. It's for them to do whatever they want with it. It's on our land. They will proceed with it. We don't interfere with it. You don't talk about it in school. You don't. I mean, this remains within our family. We just don't talk about it. And the kids didn't talk about it. If you go there to some of the little cafes there and so on, you're going to see the posters from those days. I mean, the posters say, you see something, you don't say anything. You see something, you don't talk. Right. No gossip, none of that. People will die if you talk. It was very clear that that White Sands had been infiltrated, that there were probably German spies. In fact, we know there were German spies. Right. They were caught later. Probably Russian spies, maybe spies from other countries, or maybe scientists with divided loyalties, and so on. So if everything was compartmentalized, everything was, that object obviously was not a weather balloon, obviously was not anything anybody had seen before. It was very large. It was the size of two trucks. It was 15 feet high. It had a flat. So later, one of the kids, Mr. Padilla, who is still alive, decided to go inside. He was very bright. I mean, those two kids were very bright. You grew up very fast in those days, and you were aware of danger. And I can testify to that because, I've lived through a number of bombings of my town when I grew up, to cut off communication, German communication, and to cut off the German retreat. So both the railroad bridges and the railroad bridge and the road bridge were destroyed. And essentially much of the town was in ruins after those bombings. There were 17 bombings to destroy the bridges and to destroy the German facilities all around the town, because it was known that the invasion of France would have to come after the Normandy. The invasion of France would have to come through that particular spot, so it had to be cleaned up of German, German forces, and it was, but at a price. And when you're 4 or 5 year old and there is an aerial battle above your town, you see it. And you understand what a tank is and how it works. There are tanks in the streets. So I think I can relate easily to what why those kids never spoke. The question is, why isn't that in the Air Force files? Because as you know, I've worked, including in the classified setting, with people who had access to, the military files through ATIP and through, BAS, which was funded by the Pentagon.
Right.
They had never heard of the details of what happened at Trinity because it came through the atomic secrets. And here we have another point of, where we can control point. There was an aerial battle over Washington in 1956, where there were a number of UFOs literally over the White House and over the Pentagon, which isn't supposed to happen. So they were very elusive. So the Navy sent their planes and the Air Force sent planes. And one Navy pilot was authorized to shoot at a disc and broke off part of it. The part that fell was recovered and was studied. And I've spoken to some people who actually handled it much, much later. I mean, and at the occasion of congressional hearings that I was part of.
Right.
And that part of that piece was turned over to the Canadian government, which had, as you probably know, a UFO research project. And the officer who took it there, who was the carrier, told his Canadian counterpart that the subject was classified in the United States above the atom bomb. The UFO subject, the UAP subject, was classified over the atom bomb in the Atomic Energy Commission files, which became the Department of Energy, right, where, again, Dick Ray was the director for a while. Dick Ray was a very bright scientist and a good politician, but she was a physicist, and she was, fully qualified to lead the transition from Project Manhattan to the Atomic Energy Commission to the Department of Energy. And that's where the secret was. It is.
Yeah, and it's so unbelievable that I can see why they would obviously keep that a secret if it's looking at atomic energy. But you're right, there is the ridicule still we talked about earlier. You mentioned about witnesses coming forward. Back then you were not able to speak about it because you would be ridiculed, you'd be made fun of, potentially you'd be scared for your own life, I would imagine. So I can see why that secrecy is still there. And then, fast forward, we get to Roswell, and that becomes more of a pop culture major event within history around UFOs. We have crash retrievals. We look at both incidences with crash retrievals. And now moving forward, we're having a really large conversation. Christopher Mellon's been talking about it in different media interviews that he's been doing. There are these conversations that whistleblowers will be coming forward at some point in time, speaking about crash retrievals and probably testifying it under the Whistleblower Protection Act. Have you heard about that? Have you heard that maybe what time that might happen and who some of these people might be? And are they government? Are they civilians? Because it will be one of the biggest conversations we ever have in this UFO topic. I think when we have people that are protected, but also then we can talk about Trinity and we can talk about all these other events that have happened and all these materials that we're analyzing now and actually have witnesses or people that have touched it and analyzed it. So have you heard any of that? And if so, when do you think those conversations will be moving forward within Congress?
So there have been witnesses, including men and women in uniform, who have reported what they saw, and including what they could retrieve. So it's not unprecedented. Paola Harris has written a book with one of these whistleblowers who had the courage to report that he was part of some recovery operations. But there is always a question, because it's borderline illegal, for him to come forward the way he did. It undoubtedly is going to be an extraordinary, page turning when people can openly talk about what they've worked on. So it's not so much the fact that they've seen something, but it's the fact that they've actually retrieved something or worked on something. Now, that's not, again, you were talking about the secrets of Silicon Valley, that there are lots of secrets in Silicon Valley. When the government wants to classify something, because they need a special thing, usually they come to Silicon Valley to get it. And usually it's in some unclassified, on a shelf somewhere. Some engineer worked on it and it didn't have an obvious application, so it's still there. But it may have a classified application. So then all of a sudden the patents disappear, the object disappear. There is a large program built on something, but that's 2 years after it was discovered by somebody in Silicon Valley in an open lab. So come on, I mean, there is a range of things that can happen, and also if you work, around San Jose or Palo Alto, you have access to experts who know how to keep secrets. I mean, I can tell you as a venture capitalist, I've never signed a non-disclosure agreement. People who invent something all around the world will ask you to sign a non-disclosure agreement before they can tell you what they have. Silicon Valley doesn't do that, because you could have 6 or 7 people inventing the same thing pretty much at the same time. Ideas are in the air, and by experience, that's not what's going to make the success of the company. Success of the company isn't the patent. I mean, the patent is going to be important later, but by the time we develop the invention, there will be 15 patents around it, not one. So that patent or that invention by itself, of course, we're going to keep it secret. And we're not going to share it with some other group that's working along the same lines, because that's not the factor that's going to make the success of the corporation. Could make the success of an inventor, but that history will write that after us. So the secrets are kept in Silicon Valley much better than they are kept in Washington. Washington is a place where you trade secrets, not where you keep secrets. I mean, look at the number of times something has appeared in a newspaper that wasn't supposed to appear, but somebody wanted to place a story in that newspaper. Somebody in government felt it was more important to place a different story, and there was a trade-off. Okay, there was a quid pro quo, if you forgive my French. But in Silicon Valley, that doesn't happen, because the good reason why it doesn't happen, certainly in venture capital, is if you're managing a $200 million fund, which is an average fund by today in Silicon Valley, if you betray an inventor's secret, you're not going to raise your next fund.
For sure.
I mean, you're not going to be in Silicon Valley anymore in a couple of years. So it doesn't matter. And the penalty is very, very harsh.
For
because
sure.
that's the only way. I raised 5 different venture funds. You don't raise fund number 5 if you haven't been completely honest about fund 1, 2, 3, and 4. Not just successful, but credible, honest, and you haven't had a lawsuit, and you haven't had to, defend yourself against an accusation that you were leaking technical secrets around. So secrets are kept contrary to what people think and what they've seen on TV with the various theatrical recreations of Silicon Valley, which are funny, but that's not the way it works.
And that makes sense. I like the fact that you said that Washington is for trading secrets and Silicon Valley is keeping those
Well,
secrets. It's a great
it's not.
comparison. Yeah,
Yes, uh, I mean, as a journalist, examples of that, are all over the place.
for
Uh,
sure. I would like to ask you one. I have two last questions for you. One, because you are the internet pioneer, you very much are in this. And I'm curious to see what your thoughts are about the metaverse. And I know this will go into UFOs, but I'm curious to see what you think about the concept of the metaverse. And then I'll ask you my other question after that connected to the UAP topic.
so that's a very interesting question because people don't really think about the history. They think it's something that Facebook just invented. Uh, Everywhere that talking about the internet, there is the historical thing that it started as the ARPANET, and then the ARPANET died after it was a successful demonstration, and everybody sort of went home. And it was revived not by the Pentagon, but it was reinvented by NSF, National Science Foundation, which is a civilian organization, a granting organization of the US that funds most of science, uh, most of, and they needed it because in one way to link researchers together, but they also needed it to cut cost because this way you didn't have every university, they didn't have to go buy a computer. Everybody could join on a network of computers that was already linked and operational. So the
Right.
facility was there, and then people could just connect to it, which is what we're doing now. I mean, you didn't have to buy a computer for us to have this discussion, not a big computer. And so then the internet was built on top of ARPANET, and then the web was invented. There were a lot of the things we discussed were running. For example, this AI program I designed was operational in 1986, which is 10 years before the web. We don't need the web to do a lot of calculations and to do all those things. But now that we have the web, it's a lot easier to give access to the public. It's a lot easier to have a human interface that's simple, where you don't have to learn programming. Now, 15 to 20 years ago, a group of bright computer scientists came to us, and I reviewed their plan. And their plan was for a fictitious world in which you could have a character that would move around. And this was in the very early years of the web. So it was in the late 90s, 95, 96. They had a program that did essentially, an artificial world. And their idea, they were very bright computer guys from Israel. Israel has some of the brightest, programmers and computer scientists in the world. but the company was a California company, and part of the development was in Israel, part of the development was in San Francisco, actually in my office, because they had only 3 people in San Francisco. We housed them in our office. And the idea was you could have a bus, a little bus, that would go from one location to another. Suppose you were a big computer company or a big commercial company, and you wanted to demonstrate new products to vendors or to people who use your products. So you had clients like, Procter and Gamble and, a number of different clients around the world. So the bus would go to Procter and Gamble, and the P&G people would get into the bus. The bus would go to a location where there was a demonstration, and they would get out of the bus into a classroom, and they would see a demonstration of the new product that you wanted to sell, computer product that you wanted to sell to Procter and Gamble. Maybe a new, a financial product or accounting product and so on. Then you could go to AT&T and with the same bus. And so you would see that on your screen, and you would have a little character that could get on the bus, would go to the demo and would see the demo and so on. That didn't take off, for a very interesting reason. Like there were a number of other companies that were doing, that kind of demonstration in fictitious reality, artificial reality. And the same thing, they didn't succeed. We succeeded because AOL looked at the software and they thought the software was so clever that they could use it for other things. So they bought the company, and we actually made money selling the company. The application died. I mean, they gave up they didn't care about the application. It was never on AOL. But AOL needed the software because it unlocked some capabilities that they had never seen before. So they bought the whole team and they bought the whole thing. So the reason it didn't take off is a typical computer science reason that the market probably doesn't appreciate. And I'm not sure that Facebook has thought it completely through. I mean, obviously Facebook has thought of it, but for people write software in the old days in COBOL, in Fortran, then in XX or in Super this or in different languages. Those languages are standardized, so that when you go to a computer school, you're going to learn that language. I mean, everybody knew that you could hire somebody who knew COBOL, on day one, and you could hire a programmer who can start programming on day one if you are a bank. Everybody knew COBOL. All the banks use COBOL. They still do, by the way. I mean,
oh, really?
Well, if you look carefully, probably a lot of really basic financial programs that nobody wants to touch, that have a core in some old language that hasn't been rewritten. But that never happened with artificial reality. So the danger is that you're going to launch a program that's written in a language that nobody understands except you. And if you're Facebook, you have 3,000 programmers who know the language, and they are very good. So yeah, you can do it. But if somebody wants to if I want to write an application that works on your program, Facebook, I'm going to have to hire a bunch of people. Either I have to steal your programmers, or I have to hire a bunch of good programmers and teach them your language. Now, I'm not sure your Facebook language is going to be the standard 5 years from now, when I'm going to be a big company.
Would
So
they not
what?
open source it though? Would they not, have it an open source where it almost the metaverse becomes what the internet is now, but in a more advanced term, and then it's where it's
That
around us? Yeah. Because they could
that's a
Facebook could
problem
open it up. Yeah.
that's a problem that our little American Israeli company had. That you're locked into you have to have a representation of the universe. You have to have a representation of human characters and what they can look like. You have to have a representation of what they can do, how they act on objects. So you have to have a representation of objects. So it's like Hollywood when they do special effects. And yes, there are bits of languages that describe that, that Hollywood has developed, that different companies have developed, that graphics, have emerged out of graphics and so on, that are extremely good. But they're extremely good for a particular application, usually an engineering application or a cinematographic application, not for having, a billion people on Facebook doing their shopping every day on, thousands of different shops and thousands of different goods, which is the way Facebook is going to make money, is, getting $1 for every transaction that where people are doing their shopping. So, right. and navigating this artificial world in a way that's understandable and so on. So there could be a language war in that artificial reality that we're going to. If there are 4 different implementation languages, it's going to be chaos. And of course, you can resolve it by brute force, which is what we do now when that situation appears on a small scale. But it's going to be very expensive, very, very expensive. And I don't think anybody has looked at the numbers. And the numbers not today, but the numbers 5 years from now.
Oh, I can imagine it would be astronomical. Now, just say hypothetically, and here's my last question. Hypothetically, we get into one open source, metaverse or meta that let's just say Meta, for example, Facebook and Meta decides that it's fully open sourced and Meta does take over. This concept of mixed reality now, where it is within our primary world that we're living in and it's around us, maybe even within us at some point in time. But let's just say it's around us. Now, my question to UFOs then is if we're in a mixed reality and say it's in us or it's consumed in us, the concept of UFOs could almost be obsolete because of what we're seeing is now being a projection of something, because it might not be there. It might be something that we're seeing around us that the metaverse is creating. Now, does the concept of UFOs go away? Because you're almost having Silicon Valley is controlling what you see in your primary world. Could we get to a point where UFOs are not even a conversation of existence anymore?
Well, I've turned over to Dr. Nolan a series of artifacts that had been picked up for a while in different sites around the world, including the data that Professor Stewart had from Brazil and so on, that he donated to me. So that collection is not artificial. I mean, these are pieces of materials that are real in this reality, not real in hyperspace. So yes, people can do simulations of what UFOs do. And I mean, Mr. Spielberg did that pretty well, in his movies. But there is, where is the link to physics? Because what's interesting about Trinity is, of course, the object itself. But in the book, you know, again, I'm an information scientist, so I look for patterns of things. So I don't look at one thing in particular, except as an instance of a group. Okay,
Right.
that's good physics, and it's also good mathematics. So there are two other cases that are almost identical to Trinity. There's Socorro, you know, in 1964, and then there's Valençol in France in 1965. They are very special because in both cases, an object came to the ground, left traces like Trinity did. In both cases, there were occupants who looked like the occupants at Trinity. They were humanoid, they were about 3 feet tall, and they breathed air. They didn't have a mask. They didn't have a helmet. They didn't have a breathing, a breathing equipment. So the in both of those cases, the case was investigated by the state of New Mexico. The FBI was there and helped in analyzing the traces, preserving the traces, but they had no jurisdiction. But we have the testimony of the FBI as an extra resource. The state police, the investigators from White Sands, from the army at White Sands, and of course the Socorro local police were involved. We know everything about that case. There is a file of something like 150 different documents about the case. And it is unidentified. It has remained unidentified. Dr. Hynek was there. I was working with Dr. Hynek at the time. I was at Northwestern, and I assembled a team of people from University of Chicago and Northwestern to get the data when Dr. Hynek came back the next day to put all the data on one table and to start looking at it, because we were interested in looking at the geometry of the traces, which was very special, and excluded any idea that it was an American prototype or any prototype of anybody from looking just at the geometry of the traces that Dr. Hynek brought back. So the case in Valençol was on July 1st, 1965. I've met the witness. I've spent several days with him and with other people in the area. It's in Provence, in southern France. He saw an object that has, a similar shape. And again, two pilots who were the size of a kid, and here is, when in the book there is I don't know if you can see this picture.
I can see it. Yeah.
You can see the three objects. There is no disc. There is no flying saucer in this book. It's always an egg-shaped object or an ovoid. The kids called it an avocado because they spoke Spanish. So again, we have Trinity, we have Socorro, and we have Valençol to explain, not just one case. And so I can tell you, both Valençol and Socorro have been examined and re-examined by different agencies, both military and civilian agencies of both governments, without an explanation. So this is the problem. It's not just a kid who's seen something, so give me a break. I mean, this is real. Okay? This is something that, this is physics. This is something that a group of scientists should be aware of. They are not today, unless they read this book. And then they should start looking at the traces. They should start looking at, we know the dimensions. We know the weight. I mean, the weight has been measured. Okay? Those are objects that were weighing between 2 and 6 tons. I mean, the imprints were measured. I mean, the first people at the site were the local cops and the FBI. Okay, in France, the first people at the site were the gendarmes. So they are very good at preserving traces, around an accident and so on. That's what they do. They don't do the physics, but they do the testimony of the people who are there at the site, and the testimony was taken within the hour, and we have it.
You're
And
right.
so, and I've been involved in all three cases now. So, um, we have a pattern there, and when you have a pattern, things are different. You get to a different level in physics.
You're right. And I think that, back to Trinity, you're right. It's something that needs to be spoken about and needs to be talked about way more and analyzed, not just through yourself, but through multiple different communities within the science community. And then looking at Congress and everyone else actually paying attention to it as being, something equivalent to Roswell. Thank you, Jacques, so much for your time. I appreciate
Thank
it
you very much.
immensely. Yes, thank you. And thank you for being rebelliously curious with me today.
Thank you.